Hello friends, welcome to the EduSat Network. Our today's topic of discussion is race, sexuality and the nation, the social psychology of the other, and this will form an introductory lecture. And for this discussion we have this in the studio Dr. A. Bimal Koijam, Associate Professor, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He has a teaching experience of 20 years, and in addition to that, he is also a filmmaker. He has made documentaries and also feature films. He is actively involved in People's Democratic Movement, and also he is a trained psychologist. His specialization areas include identity, politics and culture studies. With this introduction, I would like to welcome sir and also request him to begin our today's lecture. Thank you for coming, sir.
Thank you. Let's start with, people say that a particular vision is always from somewhere. So let's have what is the vantage point? The vantage point is that we're going to discuss today is social psychology. So in that sense, what is social psychology? Let's try to understand a little bit on this. It is not a full-fledged independent intellectual enterprise as such, in the sense that it doesn't have an institutionalized form. Rather, it is often associated as a branch of either psychology or sociology. In fact, it is the practitioners of these two main disciplines are the one who works in the area of social psychology. A large chunk of the works done in social psychology is, of course, by the psychologists, but there are significant contributions. In fact, indispensable part of the work comes from those practitioners which is associated with sociology. Incidentally, that's why I'm going to look at this from both the disciplinary point of view and the possibility also of moving beyond that and look at social psychology as an independent enterprise in itself. Fortunately, I have this privilege of teaching both psychology and sociology in my professional career, and therefore I could see the vantage point where we can look at ourselves for this kind of a discussion. So without going into a technical definitions, we should move to a very core concern on the subject matter. How do we see the subject matter, for example? Let's start from sociology. Sociology would suggest you that in the classical sense of Durkheim's sociology, you said that we deal with social fact, which is like institutions and other which exist out there, which is independent of the individuals, which exercise a certain kind of coercive impact on the individuals, and so on and so forth. And it is, in that sense, is the study of society, of institutions, of things as in fact Durkheim would suggest that social fact should be discussed as thing which exists out there. A typical Cartesian way of looking at reality as an automata, or Newtonian way of looking at reality as something like a machine which exists out there. And that's a kind of an empirical scientific way of looking at the subject matter that Durkheimian sociology would position. And he would often contrast this enterprise as opposite or opposite to what is called psychology in that sense. On the other hand, psychology as an opposite of sociology in this sense studies the individuals rather than the collective, rather than the institutions and so on and so forth. But the problem is in both the disciplines, what you can see is that psychology started this particular thing, especially from traditionally it is look at Leipzig experiments by William Wundt, for example, studying the structures of mind and structures of how thought processes are in what it called the experimental model and so on. Then you have in the beginning of 20th century, around 1904 onwards, you have this Binet, which also started another stream of psychology called individual differential tradition as they call it. As you move along, people started beginning to question what is called the individualism or individualistic orientation of psychology and so on, and how do we can understand things about human behavior and mind without taking care of the social institutions and cultural dynamics within which individual exists, and so on and so forth. In other words, individual is not a context-free individual, and therefore you cannot study individuals devoid of the ambience, social, cultural, and political ambience within which he exists. And that's a kind of crisis in social psychology that you talk about. Gergen, for example, in the early 70s, when he started questioning social psychology as a history. It's not an empirical science, it's more like a history, for example. And that's the kind of a trajectory where you see that the idea of not studying individual devoid of its social context has become a concern. But more often than not, on the other side, for example, in sociology, it is taught, for instance, that the individual is not their concern. We only study the objective realities of the institutions and group processes and so on. But on the other hand, there is always this question of the human agency. How do we grapple with this? Human subjectivity and so on. And that tradition you can see in such perspective as symbolic interactionism, George Herbert Mead, which is incidentally a philosopher whose theory gets identified with sociology, which is also taught in psychology, in social psychology, as many of you must have been aware of that. There's Alfred Sue's positions in contrast to George Herbert Mead, where for Mead, the social is a fact, but individual agency becomes a problem to be addressed in his theory, whereas for Alfred Sue's, for instance, the individual is given, but the social has become something that we must grapple with. What I'm trying to suggest is that this individual agency, subjectivity, has been a part of the concern in sociology as well, which is reflected in the debate on functionalism. How do we grapple with the issue of what is called in Aristotelian sense the final cause? What is the purpose? What is the intent of an action? And on this kind of a debate, you can see in functionalism, in issues on functionalism, you can reflect on that. In a way, even not many people are aware of this, but even Durkheim, the one who has insisted on not studying individual in sociology, for example, would often talk about an aspect on this subjectivity and individual, and very curious statement by him in an essay which came out in 1909, where he argues, this is called Contribution of Sociology and Philosophy, Psychology and Philosophy to Sociology. He argues that the mission of the sociologist shall remain incomplete if you don't penetrate into the individual's depth of individual's psychology. So the idea of individual, if you don't take care of individuals, the mission of sociology shall remain incomplete, is what he was saying. But interestingly, what he positioned individual is, he says that for sociologists, it's not the point of departure; it is the point of arrival. In the sense that your journey begins from the collective, and then you arrive at the individuals, and that's how the mission gets can get accomplished according to him. So you have these two journeys you can look at it. For psychology, the journey starts from the individual and they end up with the problem of the social. On the other hand, sociologists, if you look in this Durkheim sense of completing the mission by penetrating into the individual psychology, then it becomes that the journey begins with the social, and then you try to grapple with this individual at the end of the day. So it is the meeting point. If what was the departure point has become the arrival, the individual, which is, it is the point of departure for psychologists, but it is the point of arrival for sociologists. But similarly, the point of departure for point of arrival for psychologists, which is the social, is become the point of departure for the sociologists. It is this particular phase of this meeting point is where you can locate what we call it social psychology. And it is this particular discipline, a particular kind of looking at the reality, the perspective that you have as that particular domain is what we can consider as social psychology, which looks into the relationship between the individual and the collective, between the subjective and the objectivity and subjectivity, and between culture and the nature. In fact, this is one of the ways in which Sergei Moscovici says that social psychology should study these interactions among these variables, the individuals and the collective, the nature and the culture, and the culture and the psyche, or objectivity and subjectivity, if you may like to call it so. That's the vantage point of social psychology, which takes into account these interactions between the two. The second aspect that I would place in front of you on social psychology is, like both sociology or psychology in the classical sense, is part of the what is called a scientific temper. It is the empiricism that guides the inquiry, something that was alluded to by Auguste Comte, that whatever conceptual categories and techniques that we use, and which have given us this spectacular results in the way we understand the natural order, the same kind of things can be deployed to understand human affairs. And that kind of an orientation has led, of course, later on you see Durkheim taking a departure from him again by insisting on an empirical science, on nomothetic research, of developing a theoretical model on understanding of the world based on empirical data, and so on and so forth. Both the disciplines, psychology and sociology, in their sense, are empirical science, and both of them gone through over a period of time a crisis of that position on this claim, their claim to a scientific discipline in the sense of being an empirical science of the way natural sciences are. And that new perspective is often called the new turn, which is not only specific to sociology and psychology, but you can see this in various domains of human knowledge, which is referred to by various names, which is the new turn is called the interpretive turn, the linguistic turn, the narrative turn, the interpretive turn, and so on and so forth. Incidentally, this notion of interpretation is become very fashionable, a dominant way of looking at it, this discursive turn, narrative turn, and so on and so forth, in 1960s onward, along with the rise of post-structuralism and so on. But the fact of the matter is, in both the discipline, in sociology, you have a tradition right from the beginning, so to speak. One of the founding fathers of sociology, Max Weber, sociology is an interpretive sociology. And similarly, schools like Freud, if you take it, psychoanalysis is essentially, in one sense, involve a lot of interpretation as we understand it. But nonetheless, overall in social sciences, there is this new turn, which is termed as discursive turn, linguistic turn, narrative turn, and interpretive turn. So you have this, both the vantage point of looking at reality in terms of collecting data and trying to have a nomothetic understanding, generalizations of the phenomenon, and to understand them within a larger theoretical perspective, a theory which is derived from these empirical data and your generalization that you do it. That's one part of it. The other part, because of this new turn, you also have this new form of understanding and or activity through which you can have new way of understanding. It's called interpretations, and narrative analysis, discourse analysis, and so on. So the second aspect is, in terms of a theoretical or methodological orientation, you can have both the vantage point. Either you take the notion of empirical data and nomothetic science, quantitative research, and so on. The other way, you can talk about generally what is being referred to as qualitative studies, ideographic oriented, interpretative mode of understanding reality. So both ways you can use it, for the scholars of today. So it is these two perspectives, one on methodology, and I've tried to map out where social psychology is located, the meeting point between these two traditional disciplines, psychology and sociology. Now, it is with this understanding that now we can look at the substantive issues on the issue of race, sexuality, and the nation, for example. How does it apply to this understanding of social psychology? How do we make sense of these substantive issues through this social psychology? First of all, nation as contrast to state, for example. State is an institution. State is a social fact at one level. It exists independent of the individuals. It's almost like you can think in a Durkheimian sense, state exists as a thing out there. It exercises coercive control over you and so on. So unlike the state, then you have the idea of nation, which is a psychocultural concept. It is a subjective reality. And the idea that we belong, we come from a common ancestry, or we have a commonness, whatever is the commonness, you may not sense it, but that, a particular invocation of a category, you feel that you belong to it. It is something that you must be aware of in social psychology theories like social identity theory of taskful, or self-categorization theory, which is an offset from that particular school of thought. There, nation is something like a cognitive category with which you identify yourself, and emotions and subjective feelings that are invested in along with that identification. So you can see that nation and a state are not one and the same. In social psychology, we can deal with both the objective aspects of that as well as the subjective aspects of the nation. Specifically, when we look at what is known as nation-state system, implicitly we assume that all the countries in the world are nation-state. That's why it is called UNO, for example, United Nations Organization, rather than United Nations States, Organization of States. We don't say it because as if all the member states are nation-state. And this has a history. If you look back, particularly with the Westphalian Treaty in 1648, the idea of a sovereign power which is to be exercised over a given territory under a particular king, for example. That's idea of sovereignty. And later on, you have developed this idea of the state. Later on, the justification for this power of the state was invested with something called the nation, especially in French Revolution, in its Article 3 of the French Declaration, where it says the sovereignty rests with the nation. It is, in fact, the beginning of the fusion of the concept between the nation and the state. For the state to exist and to exercise its legitimate power, you need the idea of nation. And so you have this idea of, in the name of the nation, national security, national development. That's the language that we talk about it. So in that sense, this fusion of the nation and the state, an objective and psychological state, is how you make sense of the contemporary nation-state system, that we take it as given. It has both objective side and it has its subjective side. It's like the relationship between home and house, nation-state relationship. A house is like the state, if you may like to call it, more objective, concrete. And home is a subjective feeling, certain meanings and certain emotion invested with that. In other words, it could also be our subjective sense of who I am, for example, and the body as our more objective reality, and our feeling as more subjective kind of a thing. So in that sense, nation-state is the idea. This is the first key concept that we have to understand. And the second one is the notion of race, for example. Race has, in the beginning when it evolved, it has some essentialist biological sense. But today we know that it has been formulated more like discursive formulations, like racism without race, or as Etienne Bolivar would call it, neo-racism, and so on and so forth. The meaning of race has shifted. But in the conventional sense, even today, it refers to the physicality of your color of your skins and how you look. And this is how the idea of race is being often used even today. That's the general sense. And the second aspect of race is that this concept cannot be studied devoid of a particular context. Even when it emerges in the West, there is this imperial colonial expansion, that political process, the emergence of the nation-state system, whereby the idea of minority gets created. It is once this idea of the nation based on certain cultural religious group, invariably it produces certain idea of minority. For example, under the Treaty of Westphalia, if the king says that his country is a Protestant country or a Catholic, if it is a Catholic, the Protestant becomes a minority, and if it is a Protestant, then you have the Catholic as minority. So the idea of the minority itself, in the way we understand today, has this particular deeper connection with the idea of the nation-state system as it began in Europe, and it continues to be so in some way or the other, because the notion of the nation is, as I've said earlier, is a psychocultural concept. So you have the idea of an Indian culture, and through the articulation of Indian culture, how certain people gets created as the other within that nation and so on. I'll just come to that very quickly. Before that, let's talk about the third key concept that we have today, called sexuality. Again, sex is an important, what should we say, an epistemic category to understand human affairs. If you look, for example, in Freudian theory, much of his understanding of cultural institutions or behavior is centered on sex. That's a very well-known part in psychology or otherwise in other disciplines as well. This particular aspect, we can think about it in a slightly different vantage point as well. Most of the theories, why is that sexuality is important is also because fundamentally we have a body, and that's a fact, and sex is part of that. For Freud, and that's how he theorizes his development of his theory, because of this reality of our bodily existence. It's a part of that, and he theorizes based on that. But in a very different sense, even in other non-Freudian way of looking at it, sex also comes as a very important analytical category. Take, for example, in Michel Foucault's work, if you think his theory of, for example, biopower, where sex comes as a very important side. In order to grapple this non-Freudian, but the manner in which this particular importance of sexuality is brought in, let's go back to the idea of what sovereign power is all about, as Foucault was discussing in his books, such as in History of Sexuality, especially if you see the last part in first volume itself. The idea goes something like this: we have a body again, and we are a life form, and the patriarch of a family, as he would suggest in the olden times, and this notion of the patria potestas, because the patriarch of the family has a right to kill anybody in the family, because he is the one who guarantees their life. It's something like in capital punishment we often talked about the fact that only God can take our life because he's the one who gives life. In a very similar sense, this idea of the patria potestas suggests that he is the one who guarantees your life, and therefore he is also the one who can take your life. This is, according to Foucault, the original way of the originary sense of the sovereign absolute power of a kind. But later on in the classical period, his power has been sort of codified and constrained. Now, the sovereign power can only take life insofar as the sovereign life itself has been challenged. Unless his life is not challenged, then you cannot exercise that kind of a power. It is something like today we said national security. If you challenge a sovereign power, then the state has a right to use violence even to take your life. So in that sense, it was made conditional. And then he traces back the evolution of this power to a moment where he says that in the beginning of modernity, the old forms of power, which he referred to as deductive power, which is an extractive power, like you don't pay tax, then I detain you, I take over your land or your cattle and so on, I put you in prison. This is roughly a simplified way of looking at what he meant when he said deductive power. And unlike this power, he thinks that a new form of power emerges in modernity, and that's what he called it biopower. And biopower is in opposite to that notion of restraining, disenabling. It is about taking care of life. It's this enabling life, grooming life, this particular life form. It goes back to classical theory, the distinction that Aristotle maintained between oikos, the family, and the polis, the state, and so on, and different forms of life that inhabit in these two domains. In the oikos, for example, our natural life, in simple terms, natural life would mean we drink, eat, breathe, sleep, and sex for procreation. It is the basic aspects of maintaining our basic life form. And in the polis, you have this life form, which is what can be called a qualified life. Search for a good life, for example, what is good, what is bad life, what is beautiful, what is ugly, so to speak. So it is a qualified life. It's not simply those natural aspects of life. And this is exactly what Aristotle would remind us when he says that man is a political animal. Over and above this basic natural life, we have a political life, a qualified life that distinguishes us from the animal kingdom. From the rest of the animals, and that's what political animal means when Aristotle says. Now, this distinction between the oikos and the polis gets blurred in the modern times. What Foucault is trying to say is that the very natural life itself becomes a site for the state to exercise its power. So it's not only, in other words, this whole qualified life comes in to take care of the natural life as well. And that is the kind of power that he was referring to when he says biopower. And he says this biopower has two specific sides. One is disciplining your body, and the other is regulating the population. It is in this context of the natural life that we share with the rest of the animal kingdom, our basic life form, where the state is choosing that as a site of its power. It is this moment is what he thinks that is the beginning of the modernity, where you see that this form of power emerges. It is in that sense, sexuality, human sexuality, becomes a very important aspect of the political power as well. So the centrality of sex in what I'm trying to say here is, picking up these two examples, is either from the Freudian side or a Foucaultian kind of way of looking at the modern political power. Our life form and sexuality becomes an important side, and we must understand how many institutions and how many of the praxis of various institutions has to do with this form of power and this way of looking at sexuality and so on. Combining these three key concepts, the nation state, or nation broadly, the psychocultural idea, but often conflated with the state, and there is a critical link between the two as such, as an empirical fact that we have today, and the idea of the race and the idea of sexuality. Using this, I'll just try to briefly talk about how the notion of the other is created, and how violence is sort of subjected to those others, and how do we grapple with it. I'll try to give some example from Indian history and try to make sense of it. So when the idea of India, when Britishers, to cut a long story short, when the Britishers says, for instance, that India is only a geographical expression, it's not a nation, for example, it doesn't have history and so on. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay says that we must have a history. So this old idea of modern history, of narrating who we are, that need was felt. And then also, in order to claim a political status, the institution of a state of their own, they had to argue, the nationalists in South Asia had to counter this British idea that India is not a nation. So they would say that we are a nation, and the basis for articulating that nation is largely, if I may use it, a civilizational cultural complex, which is often represented by what is called the Indic civilization. So he says that we are an old civilization, 5,000 years old, we have been there, and so on. So the idea of history and recovering a particular visibility or intelligibility through the idea of a civilization was the first step as a necessary conditions to articulate for that status of an objective state, to have a state of your own or our own kind of a position. And history is the making of history, writing of Indian history, what happened in the past, who we are, became a particular part of what can be called creating this new nation, a way of imagining the nation state, the nation called India. It is this Indic civilization, if you see, is often associated in the philosophical traditions, in its values and ideational sense, the Sanskritic traditions, those old scriptures, the philosophies, the way of looking at things, the values, and so on. And it is this element later on became associated with Hindu religion as such. And that's how the idea of the Indic gets conflated with the idea of the Hindu, especially in 19th century onwards. It became very clear that we have this new religion called Hinduism in our sense, which is a counterpart of Christianity, Islam, and so on and so forth. So in the praxis in the court, if you have Bible or Quran, then you will have Gita sort of thing. So in that sense, from a way of life, from a particular philosophy of life, a very restricted sense of religion was crafted. And this particular notion of Hindu as a religion has, in a way, a very critical umbilical relationship with the idea of the Indic civilization, which is often conflated with, therefore, the idea of the Indic and the Hindu. And that's the kind of a problem that many nationalists try to distinguish because of this tendency to conflate. So Nehru, for example, would try to distinguish between Hindu as a way of life and Hindu as a religion with limited rituals and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, what I'm suggesting is that we will understand that there is this anxiety that the Indic civilizational heritage is not to be reduced to this new sense of a religion called Hindu religion. And that's what the Nehru was trying to do with that. Hindu as a religion is different from Hindu as a way of life, as a culture, and so on and so forth. But we know that there is this foundation is very slippery, because the idea of religion itself is crafted in the image of the religion in the West, such as Christianity and Islam. Incidentally, you can get this in the discipline of anthropology on the nature of the religion itself. Take, for example, that's why, unlike Islam and Christianity, most of the other non-Semitic religion, beyond these two religions, are often used as ism when you write in English. So Shintoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, it's like a thought, it's like an ideology. But you don't, for Christianism, you won't say, you will not say Islamism. Islam is a religion and Christianity is a religion. But Hinduism, you will say that. Shintoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and so on and so forth. And that's how one aspect of the conceptual problem of religion and culture. But nonetheless, people began to see and feel a religion called Hindu, and which I'm saying is that it has a very critical link with the idea of Hindu as a culture. And it is this particular aspect which created the Muslim as the other. For example, a 19th century Bengali intellectual nationalist, Buddha Mukhopadhyay, described Muslim as the adopted children of Bharat Mata, and the Hindus as born of the womb of Bharat Mata, for example. It is this metaphor of a biological children and the adopted children, and this is where you also sense that there is something Hindu-ness about India, the idea of India, and it is this particular aspect which creates the anxiety to distinguish between Hindu as a culture and Hindu as a religion. It is this particular civilizational component which defines the, just as in the West, when Westphalia has created, Treaty of Westphalia has created that sense of a minority. If the king declares Catholic as is the religion, the Protestant in his territory, under his territory, becomes the minority. In a similar sense, most of the countries will have implicitly this majoritarian so-called mainstream, and that articulation creates so many other minorities. In that sense, the idea of India, in spite of its civilization heritage, there is an inherent aspects of this otherness of the others. I have given an example of Muslims. You can see this in Discovery of India by Nehru himself, for example. After discussing the distinction between Hindu as a religion and Hindu as a culture, he did, conclude, which is almost comes to me as a student of social psychology as a Freudian slip. He says the Muslims and Christians have adapted to the Indian ways of life and Indianized themselves without losing their orthodox religion. He talked about Muslims and Christianity, but he didn't talk about Hindus being needing to adapt to the Indian ways of life. There is something givenness about Hindu, though going by his own definition, obviously, if Hindu the culture that defines India, if absorb all kinds of other streams from the Arabs, from the Greek, then obviously those Hindus should also have been adapted to the Indian ways of life. The fact that he misses out Hindu when he was talking about, and only talks about Christians and the Muslims adapted and then Indianized, these are his words, Indianized and adapted to the Indian ways of life without losing their orthodox religion, is an implicit indication to this notion of Hinduness in this country. And we continue to have this problem in the contemporary time as well. In a very similar sense, that, for example, the people in the Northeast are also being seen as the other, precisely because of this idea of the India. For example, for the Europeans, there is this Cynic civilization, which is to do with the Chinese, and the Indic, which is to do with India. And Southeast Asia is seen more or less as a tabula rasa, as a blank slate, where they can only carry the imprints of the visiting civilizations. You can see, for example, works by Sanjay Subramanian's work, and see how that image of the Southeast Asia as not having their own, but they only carry the imprints of the Chinese, of the Indians, and so on. In that sense, you will see that how the Northeast becomes the other. Either they look like the part of the Indic civilizations, or otherwise Southeast Asian cultures, which carries the imprints of Indic as well as the Cynic. In this sense, there is something otherness about the Northeast, and which is best exemplified by this common refrain that you get to hear these days in the Look East policy, for example. You say, the Southeast Asia begins from India's Northeast. What does it mean? It simply means that politically, geographically, it is South Asia, but racially and culturally, the people in the Northeast are part of Southeast Asia. And that's why many people will be mistaken for a Chinese, for a Southeast Asians and so on. And that's a particular otherness that you have of the Northeast, because the idea of Indic and those people who carries the imprint of that Indic. There's a distinction between, almost like the biological children versus adopted children. And that creates the otherness of the Northeast. The third aspect I have tried to suggest that how these racial and cultural, in a deeply biological sense, in a physicality sense, or in a cultural sense, the way you describe the nation, which is a legitimizing idea for the state or for the political power, creates the minorities, the other, within the nation itself. And the third one, the last aspect that we must bring in, is the idea of the sexuality. How is it related? Sexuality also is linked to the idea of nations, both in terms of the metaphors that we use it, like the honor of motherland, for example, the suffering mother. You will always see, whether it is in popular cultures like in Hindi movies, say Mother India, for example, or in many cultures you will find this, the figure of the suffering mother, sort of evoking that nationalist feeling. So in that sense, the articulation of a nation itself is, in that sense, gender in a way. Second aspects, even in terms of the participations and the role defined for women in nationalist movement, this has become an issue. You will see that how women, as the nurturing and caring, should participate in the nationalist movement, or for a revolutionary organization, how they should, as a patriotic wife, what is their role vis-a-vis with their husbands or the men folk who are fighting the foreign rule and so on. So it is in that sense you can see how the gender is always implicated even in the idea of the nation. Its articulation, its way of understanding has a gender dimension. It is this gender dimension which enables us to see that sexuality is also part of these political nationalist discourses and its complexes. One classic idea of looking more sharply how this gender is implicated would be to understand that not only the nation has some link with the idea of this race in terms of biological children and adopted children, or belonging to a very different culture and racial group. Gender is also an important angle, especially sexuality, especially as it gets manifested in sexuality. It has been said by Joanne Nagel is one work I can immediately think of, where the colonizers or the European settlers, when they go to Africa and they go to America and so on, they always look at the native women as sexually untamed, wild, and promiscuous. And it has been suggested that this particular way of looking at is in a way to establish the moral superiority of the settlers, the colonizers. And it is part of their justifications of their rule by positioning them, the natives, the colonized subject, as inferior, both morally or otherwise. And in that sense, the element of sexuality is also being expressed as a way of looking at the other as more inferior, and that has happened across the world. And in India, for example, you might get to see as some scholars, Dr. Vijay Shri, who also happens to be one of my former colleagues, who would suggest, for example, about Dalit women in relation with the upper caste. It was something like untouchable by day but touchable by night. That kind of a way in which the Dalit women are looked upon by the upper caste people. In a very similar sense, you can also see that people in general, you must have heard that Northern girls are also often deeply, deeply sexualized. and often look as if the girls from that part of the country are immoral, so to speak. And this has both the political way of marking the other as an inferior. But politically it has that angle, but from a gender perspective, you might see that this is also something to do with patriarchy. This male have this split between our women and their women. So our women are virgins or desexualized otherwise. It is pure and morally superior, whereas the other woman is sexualized. This split between, in social psychology, in the works of Sudhir Kakar, you will find in the psychoanalytical theory, this split between our woman and their woman. It is a male way of possessing and also articulating a way of controlling over female sexuality in terms of moral parameters, something morally loose and something morally, what should I should say, superior in that sense, more civilized and so on. And it is this particular juxtaposition of the our and their woman, and also the way that patriarchy tries to construct and control female sexuality, gets conflated with the idea of the nation, which also otherizes some people as the other. And that's a way, roughly looking at it, why you will see that girls from the Northeast, for example, as that inferior, morally speaking, and so on. And that justifies the violence against them. So broadly, what I'm suggesting here is that when we try to grapple with the experiences of the other and how the other needs to be understood within the concrete reality of the nation-state systems, the idea of the nations and how it conflicts with the idea of the state, the idea of the race, which is physically located discourses in terms of your looks, or even invoking biological metaphor in the way you conceptualize, and the importance of sexuality, of our life form, and the manner in which the gender issues, patriarchy, control over female sexuality, the articulation of female sexuality under the same regime, or the nationalist appropriation of gender discourses in nationalist articulations about a suffering mother, the honor of the motherland, and so on. All these complexes is through which we can make sense why the others are created and how others are being treated in different parts of the world, and including in this country. So the last part is, having said this layout, how do we study using social psychology? The one is through the manner in which we try to categorize ourselves in different identity. It's a multiple identity, and so one way to study would be to see the different forms of identifications, and what is often also called the introjections of these identities, in terms of how deeply you feel it, how deeply you internalize these ideas, these categories. There are enough works using parameters of social identity theory in the West as well as in this country. You can use this theoretical perspective and see how the nation and the various identities gets, how do people identify, and the level of introjections, internalization of these categories, and associated beliefs. The second part is, what are the concomitant ideas associated with this category is another aspect that social psychologists can study in terms of what constitutes an Indianness according to peoples in terms of their phenomenological sense. And then third aspects, not to reduce into people's perception, but one can also use these phenomenological realities or the perception of the people in terms of their social locations, which class of people, gender, region, and class. All these categories one can bring in and see whether there is a differences in those phenomenological sense of identity, identifications, and the meaning they have, and their social locations. So it is one way to link the phenomenological aspect along with the structural issues, and then you can study this kind of a reality in one sense. in social psychology. And the other part is also to look very different from this kind of a set of data. The second perspective, as I have said it in the earlier, you can also think about using more of a narrative analysis, picked up a particular cultural artifacts like movies and books or popular representation in the advertisement and so on and so forth, and do an analysis of these visual or textual materials by doing content analysis. You can see how the different forms have been represented. In, say, for example, you take the movie of 1972 Ye Gulista Hamara movie, and how those movie, even though it's part of the popular culture, how they represent the Northeast is, how they represent what Indian nation is, and what we should do, and why do people feel alienated, and what can we do about it. All these are discourses which is being codified in that popular cultural realm, and you might probably do that analysis, and then you pick up the official discourses, the political and social discourses in the Northeast, and see whether the discourses of the cultural kind has any link with the political discourses and social discourses. So you can do on the other side this kind of a work. So broadly speaking, the issues that I've raised it as a social psychologist, how you can study both theoretically as well as in the methodological sense is what I have placed in front of you. And I hope it makes some sense for you to begin to think about it as a student of social psychology.
Thank you so much, Dr. Koijam, for presenting a very clear argument in front of us, and also raising important issues as you talked about race, gender, sexuality, and the nation, and the social psychology of the other. So, we would also like to tell the viewers that this is an introductory lecture, and of course we would be having more in the series, and with this we would like to thank sir for being here. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day.